Hello and happy Wednesday. So, back as I said I would be. Today's study tip is about spaced practice. So, essentially, it's the idea that you don't have to study everything every day. And forgetting things is actually an important part of learning. So, yesterday we talked about how you needed to try to remember stuff, like to recall and see if you could think of it outside of seeing it and remembering it. So, your goal today is to now space that recall out to different days. So, if you do a bunch of reading today for one of your classes, that's good. Do some reading for one of your classes, and then do a little bit of that immediate recall where you try to keep track of it. Then tomorrow, before you look at it, try and do the same thing. Try to remember some of the main points of what you read and see if you can keep track of it. Look through it for things that you don't really remember and maybe make some flashcards. And then, so if that's tomorrow, 2 days from then, or Friday or Saturday, run those flashcards. It won't take that long, and you'll probably still forget a bunch of them. But that's the best way to do it. And then you have them. Then Monday, run them again. So you want to actually space it out because your brain remembers things immediately as you recognize them. And then that goes down and you forget some and you wait a little bit. And the next time you bring it back up. And the next time it goes down, it doesn't go down as far. If you keep spacing it out and keep trying to keep track of it, you'll remember. So as regular classes, obviously we see each other 2 or 3 days a week. It's super easy to do this. I'm constantly reminding my students of things. I'm constantly bringing it back, and they're probably looking at it on days in between. But when you're doing it on your own, you have to space it out yourself. So I would say every day, give yourself a chunk of time that is just back study time for old things, but not very long. So 10, 15 minutes on each thing where you just look at it and go, okay, what are the things I remember? If it's something where you have to do flashcards, do something with flashcards. If it's something where you have to solve problems, don't necessarily solve a problem, but take a look at a problem and think about how you might solve it at minimum. So you think about the steps that you would have to take to do so. So that's the idea of spacing things out, is give it a little bit every day. It doesn't need to be a lot of it every day. And in fact, the little bit every day will be better than a great big chunk. So if you try to remember a whole bunch of things for an hour, and then 2 days later try to remember a whole bunch of things for an hour, it's going to be harder than if you just did 20 minutes each of those days and tried to pick up more things. So your brain feels like it's taking in information, but it can't really use it that way. So you've got to be careful about how you do that and what you're going to do with that information. So that's my suggestion, is do little bits every day of things you have to try to remember and space it out a little. So do a major thing one day, the next day is a review, the next day after that, maybe do another major thing and try to keep it on a spaced schedule. You can't forget about things for a whole week or it'll be trouble, but you can't do everything in one day because your brain also doesn't work that way. So take your recall and space it out. So spend, like I said, I'd put aside an hour each day and just call it old stuff. You'll spend 15 minutes on each old thing that you didn't look at before and try to remember it, and you'll be ready to go. My whole allergy thing is less trouble today. I think it's because it snowed. It snowed. There's snow on the ground. Well, I haven't looked out there yet in the last hour. There might not be snow on the ground, but there was. All right, so that is your study tip for the day. Your COVID-19 article update for the day. It's one of the newest articles that I found on the Lit website that I follow, and I'll link it in the notes later. It is another letter to the editor. So this isn't exactly a well looked at or peer-reviewed study. A letter to the editor can contain pretty much anything that the people want to put in. So it could be good data, it could not be good data. So it's important to read it carefully and think about it. In this particular case, it's called Asymptomatic Patients with Novel Coronavirus Disease, which is COVID-19. And it is done by people in China, so from Hubei province. So they were looking at people who were definitely exposed or were fairly certain they were exposed, but who were considered to be asymptomatic at the point in time that they were asked to essentially quarantine in some fashion. In some cases, they remained asymptomatic, but not in all cases. So it's a little bit of a misleading title because they only looked at 25 people, which, by the way, is a really tiny sample size of any kind. 25 people, everything could be random. And of those 25 people, 9 of them actually got symptoms eventually. So they didn't have it at the beginning, but they did pick up a cough later on. So none of these people had major symptoms. None of them had a fever. None of them would have been hospitalized. But 9 out of 25 is more than a third. More than a third of them did pick up a cough afterwards that was noticeable, and then they treated them. And I can't really tell anything about that because they treated everybody with a cough, and it's a very small sample size. So the really interesting thing about the asymptomatic patients is that every single one of them except one, so of the 25, 24 patients, they did CT scans on them, which is where they look at the lungs, did show that there was most likely viral infection in the lungs. So this paper relied on CT scans instead of viral RNA, because as we know, if the virus is replicating either in the wrong places or not enough, you might not have viral RNA. There's a lot of false negatives that go along with that. So in this case, the CT scans were actually very interesting because it showed that even the people who never developed symptoms clearly had something living in and doing some stuff with their lungs. However, they did CT scans at the end after the people had been discharged, and all of those people had clear CT scans. So it cleared itself up just fine, and the lungs were able to heal themselves no problem. But this is actual evidence of some asymptomatic transfer, which we already pretty much knew existed, and that the virus can get into the lungs. It doesn't show anything about transmissibility from these people. There is no way to tell what the transmissibility of these people is. So they have it. Were they also transmitting it? Nobody knows. That's not useful information. The paper also points out, and this is the part the news might pick up, that in this case, of the 25 people, 2 of them had type A blood and 23 of them had type O blood. But let's be real, they didn't even tell me pluses and minuses on that, so I don't know if they looked at the Rh factor. There are 4 blood types. There were 25 people. The chances of this happening by chance in 25 people is actually still pretty high. I would not take blood type to be meaningful at all in this case without a significantly larger study and a comparison to people who actually did get sick in some manner. So that's what I expect the news to possibly pick up. It's a fairly short letter to the editor. There's not a whole lot of other information in it. So let's see. Yeah, they showed some of the CT scans with the ground glass look to them that definitely shows the injury to the lung tissue. They noted that they did not treat, only isolated 16 of the people who were actually continuously asymptomatic, and then 9 of the people were treated after having some symptoms. There were not a lot of comorbidities, so 16 people had nothing, and it doesn't say whether those were the people with the symptoms or not. A couple people had type 2 diabetes, 6 and 3 with hypertension. So although those are the 2 biggest problematic comorbidities in this case, obviously it's not the only thing that causes issues. So that is my interesting study for today. That the takeaways from this, I think, are that we do definitely have evidence that people can be asymptomatic, but we do not know if they can transfer the disease. And we have evidence that asymptomatic people do have virus replicating in their lungs and causing damage, and they are in some way fighting it off. These are the people we need to do tests for antibodies on once we can figure out a good antibody test and use them to figure out if we're forming good immunities and then how to check on that. So that's what I think. It's a good starting point, but not necessarily pieces of information that are useful to the public. And we should do more studies like this where we think people have been exposed, but they haven't found any symptoms. So it'd be great to have more of that. I believe a couple places in the US are now starting to ask people who have not had any known exposures or not had any known symptoms to provide blood for testing. And I think that will be really fabulous once we start getting those pieces of information, because numbers are useless if you don't actually look at a very large chunk of people, and it's not what we've been doing, and at least in the US. And I haven't read any other studies about the countries that say they've been doing the wide scale testing, because they have not published yet. So I will keep looking. I will keep you all updated. I hope you enjoyed that. If you have anything you want me to talk about in the future, leave me a message, drop me a line. Thanks.